For the last 2 years in the Archdiocese of Toronto, the 25th Sunday in Ordinary Time has been identified as a Stewardship Sunday by His Eminence Cardinal Collins. So why a Stewardship Sunday? It is a weekend for us to reflect on the Christian spirituality of stewardship, revealed through a gospel that would be seen as a stewardship parable. This year we are invited to reflect on the parable of the dishonest steward, or for us, as we heard, the dishonest manager. Effectively, a steward is a manager, a CEO of a business, the head servant who handled the business affairs of his master's estate. For us Christians, or to be more specific, for those who consider themselves disciples of Jesus Christ, we live our Christian life fully as activated disciples when we see ourselves as stewards. What does that mean? To be God's servants who have been entrusted with the gifts of time, talent, and treasure. These gifts have been given to us by God, for which we should be grateful. And they are to be used generously for the glory of God in the service of our neighbor. The great command, to love God and to love our neighbor. Stewardship, then, is not a thing that we do. It is who we are. And it becomes for us a way of living life to its full. Often when we think about stewardship or hear about stewardship, we might go into a defensive shutdown mode because here comes another homily from Father about giving to the church. A guilt trip to get more money, a time for holy fundraising. Because of this particular use of the word stewardship, the parable that we hear today often gets misunderstood. Parables are meant to provide a teaching, and this parable of the dishonest steward is teaching us by way of an example and a warning of how we ought to live our life as stewards, knowing that everything that we have is from God and how we are to use those gifts effectively. To give us the foundations for this teaching, we look to the first and second readings. The first reading from the book of the prophet Amos provides the message, first things first. The love of God leads naturally to the love of neighbor. The prophet Amos is preaching in the northern kingdom, which is coming to an end. Why? Because the Israelites were no longer worshiping God as they were instructed in the Sinai wilderness. They set up their own temples and created their own priests outside of the tribe of Levi and turned to false gods and worshiped them. Effectively, they created the god of self. The result? Injustice, selfishness. They abused the poor and the vulnerable. The words of the prophet Amos are most fitting for our generation, where we see how far God has been pushed out of our society, and then we start seeing the injustice that results from this. Abortion, euthanasia, lack of care for our elderly, war, violence, etc., etc. Effectively, for justice to flourish, God has to come first in our life, and naturally our love of neighbor will come forth. Take care of the wound, the symptom will go away. It goes back to the first principle of stewardship, knowing that everything we have is from God, and justice that we render to Him, that which we give back to Him, is to be done in service of our neighbor. To see Christ in our neighbor. The second reading from the first letter of St. Paul to Timothy is devoted to prayer, as St. Paul is directing St. Timothy on the reordering of public worship in the community that St. Timothy is overseeing. From the next line that reveals the salvific will of God, that all be saved and come to the knowledge of truth, we come to know that public prayer was becoming more of a clique, very exclusive, only praying for a select few in the community. St. Paul speaks into this error by explaining that Jesus Christ died for all, the one mediator between God and man for our salvation, the bridge between heaven and earth, the nuptial reality in the person of Jesus Christ, who married our humanity and His divinity. And so, even our prayer is not our own. It's not our own prayer. It is by the gift of God that we are able to pray. And now, through the one sacrifice offered by the one mediator, Jesus Christ, we all have access to heaven. So when I say everything we have is a gift from God, I mean it. Even our prayer, liturgical or personal, is a gift from God and ought to be used to glorify Him in service of our neighbor. One follows from the other. The more we come to worship God, the more we see our life in His hands, the more we are able to see Christ in our neighbor and to serve Him in that way. So what does this have to do with the example and warning from the parable of the dishonest steward? By way of warning, the dishonest steward was so focused on wealth that he forgot the master. We need to keep our focus on God. First things first. That our salvation is through Jesus Christ. That money, wealth, science cannot save us. Only Jesus Christ can, and has, and will do if we participate in that reality. By way of example, the dishonest steward did everything in his power to find comfortable living in the houses of his master's debtors. We need to use everything that God has given to us to work for justice in this world, which then has a reward, heaven as its reward. With this lesson, we look for ways to put it into practice. I would like to invite you to examine then our current situation. We are now at a point emerging from the pandemic, with restrictions all but gone. Each one of us has been given gifts of time, talent, and treasure. And each of us has been tasked with building up the kingdom of God. If you are a disciple, if you are baptized, you participate in this mission. Sorry. On this weekend, then, we give thanks to God for what we have received from Him. Next, we offer what we have received from God back to Him in this Holy Mass. Every time we take that envelope and we put it into that basket, what are we doing with the intention? It's the intention of that gift. It's what God has given us so that we can earn that, so that we can put it back in that basket and give it back to Him in service of our neighbor. Finally, as we receive Holy Communion, as we are transformed by the love of God who has come to us, who shows us through His poverty how to become rich, we then look and ask the Lord and examine our life to the call that He is putting upon our heart. How is He asking me today, this week, this month, this year, to serve my neighbor in our parish family, in our community, and in our society? All of this that we do now is so that we can hear, when we pass from this world to the next, "Well done, good and faithful steward, enter into the joy of your master."